Psychologists, what made you realize you were treating a psychopath? Story 1. Clinical psychologist here. At first I didn't know. If anything, given the context, he was more put together than most of my patients. The subject of his criminal past came up. I only knew he had served prison time some years before, not what he was in for. I had met with him for a month or two when this came up. It turned out he had served 2 separate sentences. Both were for serious assaults. In both cases, he was exactly the type of person society fears most. Someone waiting in a dark alley, targeting vulnerable individuals. He told me about these things as if he were talking about the weather. When I realized he expressed no remorse or guilt whatsoever, I got that same cold, gut-wrenching kind of primal fear you feel when you're out for a walk and almost step on a snake. Story 2. When I was a student, we had an interview with a woman who had taken the life of her infant with a firearm because the crying became too much for her to handle. At first, we weren't told she had been diagnosed with a severe personality disorder. We were simply told to listen to her side of the story. She was reading from a journal she kept while in the institution. Not once did she mention feeling sad that her child had died, or that what she had done was wrong. She simply read angry entries about her husband, who had left her and reported her to the authorities. She justified her actions by saying the child was unbearable. At one point, she even expressed frustration that her husband didn't believe her when she claimed she had no choice. She was very intelligent and well-spoken, and throughout the interview, she tried to gain our sympathy for being institutionalized. We later learned she would sometimes deny what she had done, and other times speak about it as if it were something she was proud of, depending on who she was talking to. She looked very normal and was an excellent speaker. Story 3. Not a psychologist, but I was present during my mother's evaluation. Well, I wasn't in the same room. It was more like a police interview room with one-way glass. I was there because they needed to interview me for an outside perspective. My mom had been arrested on suspicion of planning a violent act. To set the scene, she was handcuffed to a table and extremely angry. She's always had intense anger issues due to prolonged drug and alcohol use. I was there for about 3 hours while they questioned her. She kept steering the interviewer in circles, trying to avoid the real issue. She was disturbingly calm while answering questions about situations that would have frightened most people. She showed little to no empathy, and it was terrifying for me to watch. I had always known something was wrong with her. She had been abusive to both my brother and me. But watching how she handled the situation made me feel thankful I had left, because things could have become much worse. I haven't spoken to her in about 4 years, though she's tried to reach out. I can't trust her, and I don't think I ever will again. Story 4. Not a psychologist, but a nurse who sees way too many psychiatric cases. One time, I had a patient who was brought in after trying to break into a family's house while they were home. He was admitted to my telemetry unit because his electrolytes were imbalanced, and he was acting like he didn't remember attempting to break into an occupied home. He was getting restless, but the hospital I worked at had a frustrating fall risk policy that required patients to stay in bed, even if they were young, healthy, and capable of managing their own safety. Mental health patients often like to pace, especially when they begin to feel agitated. So there I was, trying to keep him in bed because if his feet touched the floor, a loud alarm would go off, something that only pushed him further toward the edge. I was in his room trying to talk him down and de-escalate the situation. We were chatting, and he told me he was a bad person. He said that his cat had been mutilated, and when his sister asked what happened, he blamed the dog. But then he confessed to me that it was actually him. He had done it. He hurt the cat so badly that it looked like a dog had torn it apart. He also told me he was fully aware of what he was doing when he tried breaking into that family's home, and that he wanted to hurt people. Naturally, I shared this information with the hospitalist and the psychologist. And of course, the very next day, he was discharged without any follow-up with law enforcement or outpatient psychiatric care. Story 5. You feel it in your gut first. Using validated assessment tools and constructing a detailed case history to review during supervision, that's how you test your instinct. But usually you feel it very quickly. It often starts with a subtle sense that something is off. During therapy, we typically develop a strong rapport with patients, and there's a lot of micromimicry involved. You start tuning in very deeply to unconscious body language. In this state, you may begin to feel uneasy, and you can't quite articulate why. This often comes from noticing subtle micro-expressions, extremely brief flashes of emotion that we perceive subconsciously. You'll catch glimpses of contempt or manipulative smiles, which are indicators of dominance and deception. Soon after, you'll see a pattern of projection. This usually appears early on, even during the initial assessment. Being evaluated by someone can be threatening to anyone's self-image, especially someone with antisocial traits. You'll often encounter challenges to your authority, questions about your credentials or experience, followed by sarcastic remarks or jokes like, "All psychologists are crazy themselves." They might turn the tables and ask who the most unstable person is that you've ever treated. Suddenly, you feel like you're the one being evaluated. As time goes on, they begin to project more of their own emotions onto you. They might say you look sad, ask if something's wrong, or accuse you of being angry when you're not. Gradually, their body language shifts from subtle cues to more overt signs of dominance, leaning back, smirking, getting up and pacing around. By now, your gut feeling is backed up by more observable behavior, and it's time to rely on the clinical tools. The biggest indicator is their total unwillingness to display vulnerability or take a subordinate role. The interactions remain superficial, often overly friendly, with lots of banter and jokes that border on mockery. Eventually, their need to control and dominate the session becomes more obvious. If the therapist maintains calm authority, the intensity may escalate, even leading to outright intimidation. Story 6. I'm not a psychologist, I'm a criminologist. Obviously, it's not the same kind of work, and I've never been in a clinical setting, but you might find some of my related experiences interesting. Just a note, I'm going to be very careful with my language in order to maintain professional integrity, so apologies if it sounds a bit formal or stilted. I've visited a few prisons for academic and work-related purposes. Those visits weren't particularly surprising, as I knew what the inmates were convicted for, and it was expected that some would display psychopathic traits. That was really my first exposure. My area of academic and professional focus is child sexual victimization. On rare occasions, I've seen individuals who appeared to be on the path toward becoming abusers or criminals, young victims who had experienced such extreme neglect and trauma that their future behavior already seemed shaped. It wasn't my role to intervene, nor do I have the clinical expertise for that, but knowing their case histories, it was heartbreaking to witness. I've spoken with police officers, social workers, and others about some of these cases. It's like watching a massive tree fall in slow motion. You know it's going to hit the ground, and there's little you can do to stop it. I once met, in a professional but indirect capacity, a relative of a serial offender who had also been a suspect. After that meeting, I walked away convinced that this individual had been a guiding influence behind the crimes. The police strongly suspected the same, but there was never enough evidence. Both individuals have since passed away, and I can't say I mourn them. There was clear evidence of family abuse in that case as well. Over the years, I've encountered a very small number of individuals who were both highly intelligent and exhibited psychopathic behavior. This happened in the course of my work. One person openly indicated that they had harmed animals either instead of or as preparation for targeting children. I won't go into detail, but what they said still haunts me. It's something I've never been able to repeat, not even to close friends or to my own therapist. Another person I encountered managed to escape justice. They were extremely intelligent. This wasn't due to a failed investigation. Quite the opposite. The police did an excellent job, and a lot of justice was served overall. But this individual avoided accountability simply through sheer cunning. They were responsible for sustained, serious offenses and clearly fit the profile of someone with dangerous antisocial traits. Finally, I met a friend of someone who used to be in my social circle, another individual who had suffered abuse in childhood. I have no proof, but I suspect they may have committed serious crimes. They hold a respected professional job and appear very successful. From the viewpoint of someone who studies this field, though not qualified to diagnose or evaluate them clinically, I would say they lack genuine empathy or a functioning conscience. Many of their emotional responses seem deliberately constructed, almost like a conscious performance. The abuse they endured was among the worst I've seen documented. Understandably, they were wary around men, though they eventually warmed up to me because of the work I do. Abuse and neglect during early childhood appear to be recurring patterns in the backgrounds of many people who commit serious offenses. That said, I'm sure there are some individuals who develop harmful behaviors without that kind of history, but I personally haven't encountered such cases. I'll end this already too long post with a word of caution for anyone reading. It's easy to be horrified by the actions of those labeled as psychopaths. It's easy to be fascinated by their psychology, but they are human beings, just like the rest of us. Most of the time, their actions can be traced back to what happened to them, how they interpreted those experiences, and what they learn from life. There but for the lottery of birth go any of us. There are no monsters hiding under bridges or deep in forests. It's just us. We, as a society, carry the responsibility. We create the conditions where crime and cruelty can grow. We are the ones who shape and sometimes even create those we later call monsters. As Oscar Wilde said, we are each our own devil, and we make this world our hell. Story 7. Not a psychologist, but a counselor. The client was talking about a disagreement they'd had with their partner, something as simple as accidentally spilling water on some electronics. Honestly, it could happen to anyone. But then, as calmly as if he were describing something like changing a TV channel, he said that he pinned his partner up against the wall and started to strangle her. No emotion, no change in tone, just like it was a normal thing to do. I was a trainee at the time and not qualified to handle domestic violence cases. Needless to say, I transferred the client to another therapist. However, I wasn't allowed to end the session and had to sit with him for another 20 minutes or so. I've never been so afraid in my life. I felt like a small prey animal trapped in a room with a predator. He just didn't care. If you met him outside of that session, you'd think he was just a normal, successful, average guy. But I am 99% sure he was a sociopath. He kept trying to provoke specific reactions from me, constantly changing his approach, attempting to charm me. And when I didn't respond the way he wanted, he became coldly irritated. I've never had another client like that before or since. Story 8. Gather around, kids, for I have a jail time story. It's not about me because I'm a well-adjusted individual, but it is about someone I shared a cell block with. To avoid revealing too much, let's just call him Wolfgang, because that was actually his name. This happened back when I was housed in a wing reserved for high-risk inmates, mostly to keep us from getting attacked. By pure coincidence, he came from a region known for producing some very infamous figures. Upper Austria. He was serving 6 years for crimes involving minors. According to him, the victims were willing as long as they thought they'd get a €100 reward. I immediately disliked him for reasons I think are obvious. We shared a dorm for long hours. I had a bit of a playful nature, and at the time I was passionately devoted to a personal belief system, a hybrid of sorts that I jokingly called Catholic Islam. My long-term goal was to unite people through faith and be remembered alongside names like Gandhi, Mandela, and Obama. In my efforts to spread this message among both inmates and guards, Wolfgang seemed to take an interest. One day he even approached me and sang Amazing Grace to prove his sincerity. I told him his version of Amazing Grace was so bad that it might delay any form of divine intervention for another 2,000 years. That's when he smashed my face against the bunk ladder bars. Fortunately, the prison upheld the noble tradition of collective discipline, so the other inmates quickly broke things up to avoid losing dorm privileges. Of course, the guards noticed my injuries. I was questioned and immediately confessed everything. I couldn't handle the stress of the lieutenant's bad breath. Believe it or not, he became the true villain in my eyes. He punished only me, citing that I had incited violence and disrupted the dorm's peace. I know this isn't a typical story, but I believe that injustice ignited my skepticism toward authority figures. Anyway, this story is about Wolfgang. After I was cleared of any serious accusations, I was transferred to a lower security unit. I never saw him again. Story 9. I'm a bit late to this, so not sure if it will be seen, but my wife has been encouraging me to share. I actually started my career in forensic psychology, but decided to leave the field after being stabbed and assaulted a few times by patients. I later transitioned to working with children and teens. That's where, while working with an 8-year-old girl, let's call her Sarah, I encountered the first person I would personally identify as showing strong psychopathic traits. Sarah came from a relatively stable and supportive family. Her parents were genuinely dedicated to helping her progress. There were no clear concerns about their own behavior, and they seemed to be emotionally regulated people. They had seen several therapists before coming to me, most of whom had struggled with the fact that Sarah didn't display typical behavioral issues. She wasn't impulsive. She didn't lose her temper or act out wildly. Instead, she was attentive, calculating, and methodical. She had a textbook history, damaged dolls, and several animals that had been injured over time. What made Sarah particularly unusual was that she rarely got in trouble. She was remarkably good at manipulating younger children into carrying out actions on her behalf. I first connected with her through psychological testing. I had a booklet in front of her for one of the assessments. It cost about $200. Sarah slowly began tearing out pages one at a time, while maintaining direct eye contact with me. I kept a neutral expression. She asked what I was going to do about it. I told her, nothing. She continued. After a while, she admitted she was surprised I hadn't reacted. I told her it wasn't my booklet and that I just work here. That actually made her stop. The remaining 9 hours I spent with Sarah were filled with similar moments. The most uncomfortable part was her constant, intense staring. She was trying to read my reactions. I think she was unsettled by my lack of expression. When observed with her parents, she behaved the same way. Child Protective Services were already involved, but no one really knew what to do. She was about to move across the country to a heavily wooded area. I remember her father making a sad joke. At least the animals there might fight back. The parents genuinely seemed afraid of her. About 6 months after they moved, one of the worst fires in that region's history occurred. Entire towns were destroyed. I've always wondered if it had anything to do with Sarah. Story 10. Psychology student here. I once had the opportunity to sit in on an interrogation, watching from a monitor in a separate room, of a man who was clearly not like most people. At first glance, he came across as fairly normal. He even made a joke about how bland the room looked and sat down smiling. A smile that felt just like the kind politicians wear. Fake, yet somehow convincing. Initially, I thought he might actually be innocent. Most guilty suspects I'd observed before were quiet, nervous, or withdrawn. But this guy was relaxed, confident, and at ease. To make a long story short, he was a man in his 20s who had pushed his mother into the corner of a wall. Her head struck the surface, and he watched as she lay there, bleeding. She didn't survive. Throughout the entire interrogation, he laughed and smiled. It was clear he felt no emotional connection to his mother and no guilt over what he had done. Story 11. To start, I'm not a psychiatrist or anything. I'm a welder. But this thread reminded me of someone I worked with a few years ago. I'm a pretty confident guy, not easily intimidated, but this man truly frightened me. At the time, I was working for a small company as the foreman. We were hiring someone to take over my previous role building hydraulic parts. Out of all the applicants we interviewed, he was my first pick. Looking back, I now realize I had been fooled. He was friendly, too friendly. I remember thinking even then how unsettling it was. Once we hired him, things changed within the first month. He wasn't interested in anyone but himself. He had 3 kids and treated his family terribly. He once bragged to me about throwing his son's toy down the stairs and smashing it because there were scratches on it. He had a severely autistic son who was locked in his bedroom at night and still wore diapers at age 12. He refused to consider a care facility for him, even though that would have been the best option, at least temporarily. His behavior with his daughter was disturbing. He seemed overly attached to her. I still suspect he may have been abusive. He once said he bought her better clothes because girls are on a different level. He insisted only he could brush her hair because my wife can't do it right and neither can my daughter. He was a nightmare to his wife. Almost every day he yelled at her, even when she did something nice like bring him food. He had married her when she was 16 and she wasn't allowed to see her family. He also had a previous charge of kidnapping after he and another underage girl tried to run off together. They were caught a few states away. He was furious that the court wouldn't expunge his record. If you told him something bad had happened to you, he would immediately respond with something about himself. A friend of mine died by suicide, and when I told him, he showed no reaction, not even a simple, "I'm sorry to hear that." He became extremely angry if he felt someone had wronged him in any way. He was manipulative and sneaky. At one point, I even tried to help him get a promotion at the main warehouse in another state. He flew out there, and I later found out he had tried to convince them to fire me. Thankfully, he lost his temper when they didn't give in to his demands, and they informed me of what he had done. He scared me so much that I told my wife and mom that if I ever went missing, he should be the first person they suspect. I don't know if he was truly a psychopath or just an extremely angry narcissist. All I know is that I've never met anyone like him before or since. Story 12. Not a psychologist, but I know someone who was diagnosed high on the spectrum. He's a fascinating person, one you never fully trust. I met him at university parties. He was the party guy, always hosted the best ones, knew everyone, and was basically the kind of person others admired and wanted to be friends with. I always had a feeling he wasn't being truthful. I never gave him much of my time, but my friends liked his parties, so we went. One day I stepped out for a smoke, and he followed me down to chat. He started doing his usual act, trying to talk and engage. His micro-expressions explained a lot, why I never believed him. He had a reputation for sleeping with a lot of girls. but he didn't seem like a typical player. I couldn't quite put my finger on what was off. As we stood there, he kept trying to get my attention. I gave him the usual, responses, not really engaging. Eventually, he got frustrated and started accusing me of being stuck up. He said we could be great friends. I had enough and told him, more or less, no, because you're a blatant liar and you use people. I've watched it happen for over a year. I'm not interested. That's when the weirdest thing happened. His face went completely blank. And I don't mean shocked or embarrassed, blank like in a horror movie. I just stood there annoyed, making eye contact. It felt like it lasted forever. Finally, he said, "How do you know all this?" I told him I could just tell, that he used people, especially the girls he slept with, and that the parties were more about attention than fun. Then for the first time, he told the truth. I don't know how I knew it, but I did. He admitted he had been diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, ASPD, when he was younger, and it was later confirmed. I had been right about his motivations. His face remained mostly blank, with only the occasional twitch. Then suddenly, he snapped right back to laughing and joking, trying to get a reaction out of me. Over the years, we had a few more interactions like that. I still bump into him occasionally. It's always the same. He manipulates people or takes someone home from a party, then looks over at me and gives me a wink, like we're sharing some private joke. Story 13. I'm not sure if he was a confirmed psychopath, as I didn't interact with him consistently or long enough to know for certain. I was introduced to G at a party. He was dating a friend of mine from university. We'll call her M. I hadn't seen her in a while, but we were both close with another friend, A, who was hosting the party. M and G were both there. I met G, and the moment I shook his hand and made eye contact, I knew something was off. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a chill down my spine. It was like there was nothing behind his eyes. I heard a little voice in my head saying to run. I saw him a few more times after that, and each time my instincts were screaming. I felt tense and uneasy around him. Over the next 6 months, I heard from A about how G was manipulative, controlling, and vindictive toward M. A saw M less and less. At first, A tried to reassure me when I admitted I didn't like G from the beginning. She suggested maybe he was just on the spectrum, but over time she admitted he was definitely manipulative, though she never went as far as to call him a psychopath. In the end, both A and I helped M leave the relationship. She had been living with him, but thankfully, she's now happily single. It was a frightening experience for her, but with counseling and support from us, she's come through it stronger. She says she's a little more cautious now, and even though it was difficult, she feels less naive about the world. Story 14. Not a psychologist, but 4 days ago, after 35 years, I realized on my own that my father is either a psychopath or a severe narcissist. He has never taken responsibility for anything and has never shown any remorse for the things he's done. He would blame and shame me throughout my life, but only when we were alone, so there were never witnesses. In public, he would say things like, "You're the best son I could imagine," and in private, he'd say, "I'm so disappointed in you," along with much worse. That constant push and pull made me feel like I was always at fault. There wasn't much physical abuse, probably because people like him don't want to leave visible marks. I spent 4 years doing personal development work on my own. I left my home country 3 years ago because I thought something was wrong with me. I would lie in bed and cry, terrified that I might end up in a mental institution. After 3 years of distance and hundreds, maybe thousands, of hours spent reflecting, learning, and growing, I finally found clarity. That's when I realized my relationship with my father had led me into a relationship with a narcissistic partner. But this time, I was more aware. I could sense when I was being manipulated, and I ended it quickly. When you've been through that kind of manipulation, you become a target for similar people. You already feel vulnerable, and that makes you an easy target. It's not always just one person in your life. You can't trust anyone who's been close to them. Even if someone had a good first impression of your abuser, they'll often doubt your story, and that doubt reinforces your belief that you're going insane. If you even suspect that something is wrong, I strongly recommend speaking to a counselor, someone neutral who can help you see things clearly. A key warning sign after the trust-building phase is when you start feeling confused or like you're losing your grip on reality. That's exactly how I felt. Only after deep analysis and paying attention to how my body and mind reacted to their words did I begin to recognize the patterns. Another sign that's often overlooked is low self-esteem, insecurity, constant self-doubt. These are often indicators that you're under the influence of an abuser. Their biggest tool is your trust. When you believe everything they say, it becomes almost impossible to see the truth. And everything always happens off the record, so you're left without any proof. They are extremely charming to your friends, so when you speak up, others may side with them, which only increases your self-doubt. It's like being hurt and then told it's your fault you were hurt. One last piece of advice. If you realize you're dealing with someone like this, don't confront them and don't try to rescue others in their circle. You may already have a reputation for being unstable because they made sure of it. People like that often see losing control as a threat to their identity, and they may go to extreme lengths to protect it. My solution? Cut all ties. Don't speak to them or their associates, and take a close look at your own friends to see if they share any of the same behaviors. Story 15. I remember a resident I worked with back when I held one of the orderly positions during the evening shift at a facility for kids and adolescents with special needs and mental health conditions near Chicago. This resident was a young man in his early 20s who I had worked with often. For the most part, I actually got along with him really well, and he usually seemed to show affection toward others. However, experienced staff had warned me to be cautious around him. He was very strong and had a history of delusions. Despite that, he was always friendly to me, possibly because we shared similar hobbies and both liked science fiction. One day, as I came in for my evening shift, I noticed the staff member who worked with him during the mornings had blood all over his shirt. I was told that during school, when the staff tried to redirect his behavior, the resident got up and began punching him in the face, then started using nearby items to continue the attack. I didn't witness the incident myself, so I can't speak to what exactly happened. But afterward, I noticed his empathy was different. He understood what he had done was wrong and realized the other kids were now afraid of him, but he didn't seem to feel much about the event personally. It wasn't emotional detachment. He genuinely tried to be kind and positive, but something felt off. His outbursts were rare, and while difficult, could be managed. He was generally approachable and performed well in his classes. At the same time, he was coping with life in a residential facility and dealing with the grief of losing family members. Years later, I heard he was arrested for attacking a care worker at a group home. I still think about our conversations and hope he finds a way to turn his life around. But knowing how mental health conditions are treated in the jail system, that hope feels impossible. Story 16. Not a psychologist, but I worked at a residential treatment facility for teenage boys during college. The biggest takeaway for me was that most people who commit crimes aren't inherently bad. They're broken, and sometimes they make harmful choices, but many of them still had a sense of honor. The campus was large, and the cabins didn't interact much. As a young, small woman, I was well aware I wouldn't be able to physically defend myself if a patient decided to attack. Strangely, I never felt safer than during our transitions to and from activities. I knew that if a boy from another cabin looked at me the wrong way, my cabin would stand up for me. They bonded to staff quickly because they lacked healthy adult role models. That said, there was one resident I'll never forget. Let's call him D. He terrified me. D had been in treatment for over 4 years, when the average stay was 6 months. He had just transitioned from the most secure cabin to ours, and his reputation preceded him. At first, I was naive. I thought he was misunderstood. That was the last time I let myself believe I could save someone. Over time, it became clear that D's issues were far beyond what I was prepared for. Apparently, that had always been the case. He couldn't live in a foster group home because he had a history of harming other children, typically younger boys, though if he was angry enough, anyone could become a target. He was considered unadoptable and didn't want to be adopted. He believed his mother would be hurt if he left her, but she was just as afraid of him as everyone else. I realized how dangerous he was when I noticed that he would punish himself as long as it also hurt someone else. For instance, he'd constantly provoke the biggest boy in our cabin. That boy would ignore him at first, but eventually D would say the right thing to push him over the edge. The big kid would lash out and D would get hurt, but the other boy would get punished, delaying his release. D enjoyed that. Physical pain didn't matter to him if someone else also had to suffer. One night, things were winding down, and it was almost bedtime. D wasn't cooperating, and suddenly he charged at me, fully intending to hurt me. Another therapist, a large, patient, kind man, grabbed him and restrained him using a hold technique. It didn't cause harm, but pinned him down. I ran into the office to call for backup. There were no windows, but I could hear D outside, screaming that he wanted to hurt me, making graphic and specific threats. Even after that, part of me still believed he could be helped. The next day, though, the male therapist who had protected me wasn't at work. I asked about him and was told he'd been placed on probation because D claimed his arm was hurt during the restraint. Despite cameras being everywhere, the video was inconclusive. These things happen fast and in chaos. The therapist ended up resigning, knowing an abuse allegation could ruin his career. That was the day I realized the entire thing had been planned. D had acted out to make sure our cabin got restricted, meaning we had sack lunches instead of going to the dining hall. He used that tension to escalate the atmosphere. He knew that if he attacked me, someone would intervene. He also knew that during the chaos, it would be hard to follow exact protocols and that the camera footage wouldn't be clear. He knew the therapist would likely lose his job. There was no personal reason, no grudge. That man was just the unlucky staff member on duty when D decided to destroy someone's life. That was the moment I realized some people cannot be saved. I moved to another state, took an office job, and never returned to that city again. Story 17. Not a psychologist, but I once knew someone who was diagnosed as a psychopath while we were in school. We started on the same day, so we were naturally grouped together. People tended to avoid him because, frankly, he was a little odd. He didn't really do anything wrong. Looking back, that was exactly it. He didn't do anything. He didn't seem to enjoy anything. He just followed others around silently. Years later, he and his family moved to the United States. A few weeks after they left, my mom called his mom and learned what had happened. Apparently, he'd had a violent outburst, throwing chairs, tables, and anything else he could grab through windows and doors. It reportedly took 3 police officers to restrain him, and during the incident, he had also undressed. After a brief evaluation, he was admitted to a hospital where he was diagnosed as a psychopath. Sometime later, he returned home. My mom and I stayed in touch with the family, mostly because I was close with his siblings. I went over to their house, and before going, I decided I wouldn't treat him differently. I believed even people with serious conditions deserve some form of normalcy, even if they don't fully understand it. But once I saw him again, knowing what I now knew, I realized just how off he really was. There was something about him that made my instincts scream. He could speak about disturbing things with no emotion. I specifically remember him saying he wanted to join a militant group just to be able to shoot people. He wasn't particularly intelligent, so it wasn't a genius villain vibe. But I finally understood what people mean by primal fear. The feeling when your body tenses, assessing escape routes, and gauging how fast you can get to the door. I remember one particularly strange conversation about conspiracy theories, and afterward, I stepped into the kitchen to talk to his mother. I knew her well by that point, so I asked her directly, "Mrs. E, please don't take this the wrong way, but if E has one of his moments when I'm around, what should I do?" She sighed and said, "Whatever you have to do." She told me the psychological team had warned her there was a high likelihood E might try to hurt a family member someday. She had already told the others that there was no shame in defending themselves if it ever came to that. I haven't spoken to the family in years for one reason or another, but I still wonder how they're doing. It may sound dramatic, but that day I mentally prepared myself for the possibility that I might have to stop one of my oldest friends from hurting me or his siblings. I rationalized it by telling myself that in that moment, he wouldn't be E, he would just be a threat. Story 18. I was in the psychiatric ward for a manic episode. I'm not a psychologist, but due to hospitalization, I've met a lot of individuals with serious mental health challenges. Almost all of them were kind. Then one day a new patient arrived. We'll call him Brad. Within 5 minutes of arriving, he started telling me that he had theories more impressive than those of Marx, Foucault, and Plato. He went quiet for a moment, staring into space. Then he turned to me with this fixed, unblinking expression and told me he had experienced abuse as a child. He stood up and went on to tell everyone in the ward the same thing. Later, while we were watching TV in the common room, he casually shared that he had harmed his pet and had once injured his mother with a broken CD. He also frequently made inappropriate and offensive comments, and especially targeting some of the Black employees who were assigned to our care. When a new girl was admitted, he immediately began acting inappropriately toward her, being overly suggestive and making her visibly uncomfortable. We stepped in and told him to stop, and he did, but not before yelling at her for no clear reason. He constantly sought approval from everyone around him. For some reason, he was especially fixated on me. He talked endlessly about wanting to be my friend. Then I found out he was telling others that I reminded him of someone from his past, a person who had caused him trauma. Strangely enough, we shared the same first name. At that point, I genuinely felt like he might try to hurt me. I've never been more disturbed by another person in my life. Story 19. Training psychology student here, so I don't have any personal real-life examples, but I do have a case we studied for research purposes that was particularly disturbing. A 17-year-old boy was convicted of arson and double homicide after setting a house on fire. The victims were his parents, who were upstairs on the second floor. He had started the fire downstairs in the living room and had made sure to douse the front and back doors with gasoline before exiting through a window. When he was taken into custody, he showed no emotions, except annoyance at the sound of the radio in the police car. Other than that, he engaged in casual conversation about girls and video games, as if he hadn't just taken the lives of his parents. During questioning, he described in detail how he had slowly siphoned gasoline from both of his parents' cars over several months. He didn't have a job or his own car, so this was his only method of obtaining it without raising suspicion. His parents didn't notice the gradual decrease in fuel and went about life normally. He stated that he carried out the arson as if he were making breakfast. The casual tone of his confession was described by investigators as unnerving and unsettling. At the end of the interview, he asked if their bodies had been recovered, and then asked if he could see them. He said he wanted to know what they look like after burning. Disturbing doesn't even begin to cover it. Story 20. I'm a mental health counselor at a residential inpatient facility for adolescents, and I've always found these types of discussions interesting. While reading through one, I realized I might currently be working with someone who fits the profile of a psychopath, and I'm actually seeing him again in about 4 hours. From what I know of his history, he has 4 counts related to homicide, has been physically aggressive with 2 girls, and has been involved with gangs since the age of 12. His history of violence doesn't seem to bother him much. He's currently undergoing a 6 to 9 month program that often takes over a year to complete, and he's only about a third of the way through. A part of me is starting to wonder if I'm waiting for a sense of remorse that may never come. He's court mandated to be here, of course, and on paper it looks like he's making progress. He's been at the facility for about 3 months, and I only recently started working with him after his previous counselor, an intern, left. Not because of him, just the end of her placement. During our sessions, I got the impression that he wasn't truly remorseful. He expressed interest in returning to gang life as a way to make money and eventually get his own place in the projects. He did say he wanted a better life for himself and that the project's plan was just a fallback. But that only came out after I questioned his thinking, and he seemed to agree more because he knew what I wanted to hear. He's had conflicts with other residents, but that's not unusual in this setting. When I was assigned his case, I was fully committed to helping him find a better path, like all of us in this field strive to do. Still, there's a part of me that wonders if he's simply telling me what I want to hear because I'm new to him. I've studied psychology and psychopathy for years, but I think I may have been blinded to the possibility at first. He comes across as a good kid, and that's the hard part. He's still just a kid. There's no blatant coldness or malice, no overt signs. He talks like someone who did what he felt he had to do. And the truth is, many kids who grow up in severely underprivileged environments are taught, implicitly or directly, that violence is sometimes the only way. But reading through this thread brought him to mind immediately. I don't know if I'm just more aware now, or if something deeper really is going on. Either way, I'll be watching more closely. Story 21. Before I became a psychiatric nurse practitioner, I worked as a medical assistant at my current practice. There are 2 instances from that time that I will never forget. The first one happened on a Friday morning. I was alone in the building with our psychologist, a Princeton graduate with over 40 years of experience. On Fridays, he would see a few extra patients for specialized testing. That day, he was working with a 17-year-old male. After the session, he walked out of the room with a look on his face that I had never seen before. He leaned against the doorframe and quietly said that, in all his years of practice, he had never been truly afraid of a patient until that day. I didn't ask for any details. The look on his face told me everything I needed to know. The second incident happened during late shifts on Tuesday nights. I worked those evenings with one of my favorite doctors, a very petite woman. There was a man who came in regularly who made me feel extremely uneasy. No matter what time of day he had an appointment, I was always tense when he was around. But being alone in the building with him at night, that was where I drew the line. I told my manager I wouldn't do it. The strange part was that my manager kept insisting he was harmless, that he was a nice guy. And to be fair, he had never done or said anything overtly alarming. But the way he looked at me, The feeling I got when he was near, it was something I couldn't ignore. Fast forward a year of me refusing to be left alone during his appointments. He was eventually reassigned to a different doctor who only worked during daytime hours. That's when everything came out. He voluntarily told that doctor about his extremely violent fantasies, specifically fantasies that involved me. He described in detail how he planned to carry them out, how he would catch me, and exactly what he would do. He admitted he was struggling to control these urges and requested stronger medication because he didn't think he could suppress them much longer. He was referred immediately to inpatient psychiatric care, and we never saw him again. He has been permanently blacklisted from ever being scheduled with me. Story 22. Not a psychologist, but I had a friend who showed a lot of signs that something wasn't right. The longer I spent time around him, the more uncomfortable I became. He had a flat effect. He never showed any emotion other than anger or rage. I stayed with him for a few days while I was between apartments, and he became weirdly controlling over my cat, despite never having owned one himself. I'd tell him something basic about cat behavior, and then later, he'd repeat it back to me like it was his own idea, as if I had never said it. One day while I was out, he hit my cat, claiming it had made a mess on the floor. He was a terrible friend. We'd go out for drinks, and he would barely acknowledge what I said. He'd just stare around the room and suddenly get up to approach women. He got rejected constantly because, frankly, he came across as creepy. Every night out ended either with him storming off after being rejected or dragging me home early because he was angry. On more than one occasion, he ditched me completely and left me to find my own way back. The final straw came recently. We were out at a bar, and I stepped outside for a smoke. While I was gone, he spotted a girl he had matched with on a dating app months ago, someone who had ghosted him. He walked up to her and, without warning, called her a terrible name. Her boyfriend and a bar employee escorted him outside and beat him up so badly he needed stitches and staples in his head. Afterward, he blamed me for not backing him up. He called me weak for not supporting what he did. He later claimed he started going to therapy, but then began harassing me over text again. I had to block him. This is someone who had already been in several violent situations. He was once pistol whipped for mouthing off, arrested after causing a scene at a sandwich shop, and beaten up on multiple occasions. I honestly don't know why I stayed friends with him for as long as I did. I should have cut ties much earlier. He's dangerous, and I do worry that one day he might try to find me. Story 23. Not a psychologist, but I do have a cousin on my mom's side of the family who was described by several professionals as showing serious signs of behavioral disorders. Some even said he displayed traits consistent with psychopathy. He would go around our house shouting, getting into frequent outbursts and treating our pets, dogs, goats, chickens, in a very disturbing manner. He was aggressive toward animals and had been removed from multiple schools due to violent behavior. One incident stood out. He bit another student so severely that she needed stitches, and his parents ended up being sued. He's only about 12 or 13 now, but he genuinely makes me feel uneasy whenever I see him. At the same time, I can't help but feel sorry for him. His home life is chaotic. His parents struggle with substance use and have been physically abusive toward him. When they punish him, it's by confining him to his room, which is filled with games and toys, so the consequences don't really carry any meaning. It's a sad situation all around, and I worry deeply about his future. With the lack of proper support and intervention, it's hard not to fear that he may eventually hurt someone or himself. The system seems to be failing him, and it's heartbreaking to witness. Story 24. My father's a sociopath. I cut him out of my life about 5 years ago. He was diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder around the age of 19 by the U.S. military and was discharged before completing boot camp. All I know is that there was an incident in the barracks, and he was held in the hospital facility for a few days before being sent home with a diagnosis and entry-level discharge papers. He later told people he was discharged because of a foot injury during boot camp, but that version of the story didn't appear until a decade later. I also heard stories that, as a young man, he would pick up people and then harm them instead of paying for services. I heard this both from him and from people who had known him during high school. He had a very intense sense of justice and order, but one that didn't align with what most people consider moral or legal. He once described himself as justice incarnate and often took it upon himself to punish others for what he saw as offenses. His punishments were always far more extreme than the perceived crime. For instance, if someone parked too close to a line in a parking lot, he would put super glue in their car locks. To him, this was a fair response. They inconvenienced me, I'm inconveniencing them. He even bought super glue in bulk and carried it with him. He did this about once a week. He eventually got into computer programming and cybersecurity, ironically claiming he wanted to stop people like him, though he mostly used it for profit. One time, someone at a restaurant irritated him in the lobby. He convinced the waitress to give him the name on that person's credit card receipt. Using that name, he managed to find their address, phone number, employer, and other personal details, all in the late 1990s, which was no small feat. Then he stalked that person for 2 years, sending messages, damaging property, making false complaints to their employer, and more, until the person eventually moved to another state. Living with him was terrifying. He was extremely paranoid about the government and believed in all kinds of conspiracy theories. These beliefs fed into his idea that he was smarter than everyone else and could see patterns others couldn't. He called school the idiot factory and believed formal education was just a tool for mass control. Because of that, he decided to homeschool us. But in reality, we weren't being educated. We were isolated. We studied only materials he approved of, many of which he wrote or printed from obscure sources online. When I was 11, he made me study the anarchist Bible. We didn't learn actual history or science. He ruled our home like it was stuck in the 1950s. My mother wasn't allowed to work and had to report to him every 10 minutes if they were apart. He tracked her all day. Dinner had to be served on time, and we had to sit silently in our assigned seats until he arrived. He would begin by reading a list of grievances about the world and recount any punishments he had carried out that day. This could take over an hour, during which no one else was allowed to speak. Only then could we eat. During the meal, he would assign someone a topic and force them to debate a side. He would then argue with them until they cried. No one was dismissed from the table until someone broke down. As we grew older and more resistant, dinners often lasted 3 or 4 hours. He also went out of his way to hide the fact that we were children living in the house. We never met our neighbors. All windows facing the street or other houses were covered. We weren't allowed outside, not even in the backyard. The only way we could leave the house was through the garage, and only with him or with my mom calling him every few minutes to check in. The first time I went anywhere by myself, I was 17, and I had run away from home. Despite everything, most people thought he was incredibly charming. He had complete control over us, and to outsiders, we seemed like a perfect family. What they didn't see was the intense fear we lived under. If we didn't act the way he expected, we were punished at home. When physical punishment didn't work anymore, he would harm the family dog in front of us to send a message. I have countless more stories of what it was like growing up with a sociopathic parent. If anyone is curious, it's not something you forget. Story 25. I did meet one true sociopath while working at a mental health facility, although I only worked directly with him for one day while covering someone else's shift. He was a 13-year-old boy with mild intellectual disabilities and a deceptively angelic appearance. He had a class clown personality and craved attention, especially from kind, empathetic female staff members who were often drawn in by his seemingly sweet demeanor. He was very skilled at portraying himself as a well-meaning, misunderstood child, claiming to be the victim of bullying and unkind parents. But he wasn't quite high-functioning enough to maintain the act all the time. He would act out extremely aggressive scenes with toys, lash out at people who annoyed him, and threaten women who didn't respond to his charm. Unlike many of the children at the facility, whose violent outbursts were reactive or impulsive, his behavior was often premeditated and targeted, sometimes with an inappropriate tone. He knew exactly which staff members he disliked and found ways to bend the rules without technically breaking them. We had to count his utensils after every meal to make sure he hadn't taken anything that could be turned into a weapon. I heard from coworkers that he had a history of harming animals and had previously caused serious issues at school. Even his mother seemed afraid of him. This happened several years ago, and I often wonder what became of him. He's probably aging out of the children's mental health system by now. I hope he receives the kind of long-term care and structure he truly needs. Story 26. My ex used to say that he had antisocial personality traits during arguments, often with a smug look on his face, but he was never formally diagnosed. He viewed emotions as a weakness and relied heavily on emotional manipulation to get what he wanted. This included starting conflicts and then blaming me, dragging on issues for weeks without any accountability, and making big promises, like marriage and a future family, only to withdraw them later, repeatedly. He seemed to gain satisfaction from building things up just to tear them down again. Some of the most painful moments involved deeply personal betrayals, He convinced me to become pregnant under the promise of marriage and shared responsibility, but none of that ever came true. I eventually decided I couldn't go through with it. We weren't in a place to raise a child in a healthy environment. He also tried to manipulate me into quitting my job so I could stay home full-time. On top of that, there were 2 serious physical altercations, both of which he denied, including the most recent one that ultimately led me to leave. He even lied while it was happening, which made it even more frightening. Being in a relationship with someone like that is a constant emotional roller coaster. It's not just the manipulation, it's the fact that they can be charming or attentive when they want something. They can communicate well and show just enough effort to make you think there's hope. When I was ready to leave, he would suddenly make a grand gesture to win me back. One time he even cried, real tears, and it caught me so off guard that I stayed. Another time, he offered things he'd never done before just to pull me back in. But it was always short-lived. Eventually, it would return to a cycle of broken promises, escalations, and silence. Now I've become much more isolated. I keep my social circle small and feel safer that way. I do worry about reconnecting with people and wonder if I'll be seen as someone hard to relate to. It's a struggle, wondering if I'm the problem or if people just won't understand what I've been through. But once I move out and he buys me out of the house, I hope I'll finally be able to start healing. It's going to take time, but I'm ready to reclaim my life. Story 27. I dated someone with strong antisocial traits during my first semester of college. At first, he seemed so sweet and charming when we started talking. Around the same time, my parents stopped speaking to me because I didn't end up going to a prestigious college, as if that really matters. Most of my friends had already started college elsewhere or moved out of the area, so naturally he became the person I spent the most time with. The rejection from my parents made me feel terrible about myself, and he noticed. That's when he took advantage of the situation. I grew up with pretty low self-esteem, so he didn't have to try very hard to start the emotional manipulation. He treated me horribly. He would tell his friends that I was crazy simply because I would get upset when he cheated on me or disrespected me. Because of the emotional pain he caused, I started drinking and smoking to numb myself. He noticed that too, and things took an even darker turn. He started crossing serious boundaries when I was vulnerable, including when I was asleep. One time at a party, I smoked something that made me feel disoriented, and he took advantage of that too. I remember being more aware during that moment, and I could see clearly just how disturbing his behavior was. People in the house could hear what was happening, and he made no effort to hide it. In fact, he bragged. No one helped me. When I came out of the room, everyone looked either sad or uncomfortable, but no one said a word. That was when I realized that the people he surrounded himself with weren't really friends. They were afraid of him. We finally broke up after I reached a breaking point. One day I told him he was being lazy and needed to find a job. Of all the things I could have said, that's what triggered him. He exploded and ended things. I was sad for a little while, but that sadness turned into anger. Over the years, I became more interested in psychology. As I learned more about personality disorders, especially antisocial traits, I realized my ex fit the description perfectly. Now I know what to watch for when it comes to identifying narcissistic or antisocial behaviors. Story 28. I used to work on an inpatient psychiatric unit, and one day a man admitted himself, claiming he was dealing with depression and thoughts of self-harm. The attending physician suspected that he was malingering, that he wasn't genuinely in crisis, but was seeking to manipulate the system. Still, it was my job to meet with him and do the necessary intake work. We talked about the services he might need, and I offered him several resources and referrals. During our conversation, he asked if I could make some calls on his behalf. I gently declined and explained that it would reflect better on his progress if he showed some initiative and made the calls himself. Then he asked if he could use the phone in my office. I told him he needed to use the designated client phone and directed him to where it was. At that moment, he had his face buried in his hands and appeared weepy. But when I said no the second time, he looked up and made direct eye contact with me. The tears were gone. His face changed completely. His eyes were dark, full of rage, and he bared his teeth ever so slightly. He hissed at me that it was my job to help him and that I must be worthless if I wouldn't. I immediately escorted him out of my office and into the common area. After that, I saw him giving emotional, teary speeches to other staff members and patients, doing everything he could to gain sympathy. But whenever he looked at me, he'd flash this smug, knowing grin, like he was in on a joke that no one else saw. I reported the incident to the physician, and the patient was discharged the next day. My observations helped confirm the suspicion that he was manipulating the system. But I'll never forget that moment. When the mask dropped and I saw the cold, calculating look in his eyes. It was chilling. It was the look of someone who had no empathy at all, only strategy. Story 29. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist, and I've worked in both forensic and outpatient settings. I've encountered many difficult patients over the years, but one client in particular stands out. Not because he was loud or violent. He wasn't. It was the cold precision in how he operated that unsettled me deeply. He came in through a court-mandated therapy program after being arrested for fraud and stalking. On paper, he was highly intelligent and articulate, with no prior history of violent crime. When we first met, he presented himself as polite, composed, and even a little charming. He told me he was misunderstood and that the court system had it out for him. Nothing unusual. Many court-ordered clients try to downplay their actions. But as the weeks went by, something started to feel off. He never expressed genuine emotion, only what seemed like rehearsed responses. He would tell me that he felt remorse for what he had done, but his tone didn't match his words. It was like watching an actor recite lines without understanding the role. When I asked deeper questions about his supposed regrets, he would either give vague answers or switch the topic to something else, usually something flattering about himself. Then there was the incident with my office plant. I keep a small potted plant on the table between the two chairs. One day I came in after our session and noticed that the leaves had been cut with surgical precision. Not torn or broken, cleanly sliced. At first I thought it was a fluke, but it happened again the next week. I didn't have any other clients in that room between sessions. He had done it quietly while maintaining full conversation with me the entire time. That same week he began making strange comments. He mentioned that my schedule was very predictable and asked if I always left my car in the same parking spot. He smiled when he said it, like it was a harmless observation, but I felt a chill go down my spine. When I brought these concerns to my supervisor, we reviewed his case in depth. It turned out he had a prior history of psychological evaluations during adolescence. Reports mentioned a lack of empathy, manipulative behavior, and cruelty to animals, all early indicators we take seriously.